So let's get right to birthright citizenship. We had a big decision by the Supreme Court this past week. I know LULAC has been a leader in so many of the fights that we are currently undertaking as a Latino community, specifically in the courts, as our rights are being violated and our liberties are being curtailed. So tell me a little bit about what LULAC has done as it relates to the courts in general, and then specifically with birthright citizenship. What has your work centered on?
Sure. So LULAC actually has a very long history litigating for the civil rights of Latinos across the United States, going as far back as Mendez v. Westminster, which desegregated public schools in California. It was a precursor to Brown v. Board of Education, Hernandez v. Texas, which actually provided the opportunity for Latinos to actually serve on juries in 1956, which actually is not that long ago. You know, your parents may have been young, your grandparents were young as well, but it isn't even a generation ago that Latinos were not able to serve in juries. And then obviously, you know, in 1980s, we sued INS at the time, providing pathway for citizenship to over 800,000 immigrants as part of Ronald Reagan's immigration reform public policy. In the question in regards to birthright citizenship, LULAC actually was the first or one of the first organizations to actually file suit on birthright citizenship. We did that with the Democracy Defenders Fund, the ACLU, and plaintiffs including Make the Road and the Asian Law Caucus in the first district. It's a case that we started working on in June of 2024. So literally over 2 years. And we knew this was coming, Catherine. I mean, it was clearly stated in Project 2025 that this would be one of the things that this president would use to attack immigrant status in the United States. And the work was just very, very challenging. You know, number one, LULAC obviously has standing when it comes to these types of constitutional issues and civil rights cases. But we then had to find clients, plaintiffs, which basically meant trying to find immigrant mothers who were expecting um, and working with them to get them to come forward because they put themselves also in legal jeopardy, given that their immigration status was still undefined or they were working to resolve their immigration status. And so we had 11 different women come forward, Catherine, brave women who understood that they could be potentially deported, all of which actually decided early on that if their children were born as US citizens, if they themselves would be deported, that they would leave their US born children behind and that they would go back to their home countries.
And so it just goes to the fear, right, that our communities have been living under in this new administration, not just for mothers that are expecting US born American citizens, which is enshrined in the Constitution, but also even for folks who have certain jobs that the administration might deem immigrant jobs or live in communities where immigrants are represented in significant ways, which have been victimized by um, the operations of ICE and others, right? So I do want to come back to this topic of fear, but first, tell me a little bit. I know that it's estimated about 400,000 US born uh, children, Americans, would have been impacted on a yearly basis by this case. And so, how hard or how easy was it really? I know it was hard to get these women to come forward because of fear. How hard or how easy was it to make the arguments at court?
So there were three different lawsuits. So ours was actually one of the first in the first district. We actually filed in New Hampshire. We actually won our case. And the judge in New Hampshire basically granted our request to put an injunction against the executive order, but only for the residents of New Hampshire and for any LULAC member nationwide, interestingly enough. Then there was a different lawsuit, which was filed by the Democratic attorney generals. That was the second lawsuit. And then there was a third lawsuit that was basically filed by, I think it was CASA in Maryland. And I believe the second one of the Democratic attorney generals was granted a nationwide injunction. And what ended up happening was then the Trump administration sued, effectively saying that a federal judge couldn't issue a nationwide injunction because it superseded the authority of the president, okay, in his role as chief executive officer. That's ultimately what was appealed and what the Supreme Court effectively, took up. All those cases got rolled up into one or another, and what we saw in the final case, which is Barbara v. Trump. So ACLU represented us in the first case. They argued, obviously, the Barbara v. Trump case as well. But all the organizations, all the organizational plaintiffs, all the clients were rolled up into that case. Um, we always felt that we had a very strong argument. All the cases that were brought actually won in their respective districts at the end of the day. But the concern, obviously, was what was the Supreme Court going to decide? And on April 1st, the day of the actual arguments, it was very clear that, for example, Chief Justice Roberts made the point that while the country has changed over the last 150 years, going back to Wong Kim Ark, and over the last 250 years, that the actual Constitution had not changed. And so we felt pretty confident even then that we would get a favorable ruling. The question really was it going to be a 7-2 or 6-3 ruling? I don't think anyone thought that we would get a 9-0 decision, given that the Supreme Court is very, very partisan. Um, and there are some justices that will basically just give a blank check to this president. There is no checks and balances when it comes to some of these justices. But I think what was most concerning was if you take a look at Kavanaugh's opinion, he only actually ruled on whether the president could do it via an executive order. So many actually view his decision as a partial decision, which would make it more of a 5-4 ruling than a 6-3 ruling. So I think that definitely has had reverberations, that this was a much, much closer decision than most people actually thought it would be. And of course, in the 91-page dissenting opinion that Justice Thomas put forward, and in Alito's statements where he basically said that this is the worst decision that the Supreme Court has ever made, they basically make the argument that this isn't really about in the jurisdiction of, which is a language in the 14th Amendment, but they make the argument that a person actually has to have domicile in the United States, and in addition to that, allegiance to the United States. So they provided a roadmap for potential follow-up litigation that the Supreme Court could potentially take up in the future.
And so dynamic, right? Because for many folks, as they watched the debate around birthright citizenship and how and the narrative that the administration projected was that this was really about safety, right? But what many of us knew is that it was never about safety. It really was about choosing and picking who could be an American, who matters, and who's entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so, what we now know based on the Supreme Court decision is that they've affirmed the Constitution of the United States versus executive power, and that there's still a road to go because the decision is not final or guaranteed based on these other dynamics. There were three judges that dissented. And so, to your point earlier about what's next, what is your expectation? Are there any other cases for us to watch? And how is LULAC preparing for the next steps in this fight?
So you obviously had, Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas dissented in this particular case, and Kavanaugh was a partial ruling. Uh, I think I think we have a little bit of a different view in the larger scheme because there were three other decisions. So, number one, the Supreme Court did rule to strip TPS from Venezuelans and folks from Syria, and also to turn away folks that are looking for asylum at the border, right? And so
A
those are
lot of action
two.
this week.
Yes, yes. So those are two other decisions that were unfavorable. So if you take a look at three cases, three immigration related cases that went to the Supreme Court, the only one that we actually won was a birthright citizenship one, and TPS would impact over 300,000 people. Okay, that this administration could potentially take immediate action against. Um, our view of it is that this was one part of a multi-pronged effort by this administration. First and foremost, it's their enforcement action to detain and deport upwards of 1 million immigrants per year. That's their goal. Number two, to redefine what immigration means. So, what TPS means, what asylum actually means as well, and then to basically end red birthright citizenship. And then if they were able to be successful on those three fronts, they've been successful on two of those fronts, then they can redefine what a new immigration policy is, providing new visas for individuals to come into this country only to work essential jobs, but never, ever, ever have a pathway to citizenship, and also never allowing a pathway for citizenship for their children. That was their goal, right? To basically completely end birthright citizenship as we know it, to cut off all forms of legal immigration into this country, and then to stem the flow of immigration vis-a-vis the border, and then to deport as many immigrants as they possibly can. That's still their agenda, Catherine. That's still their goal at the end of the day. And we have only really been able to limit one of those, which is the birthright citizenship. So we will continue to be vigilant when it comes to any litigation. LULAC at this point has the largest pro bono litigation network in the country. We have 11 different lawsuits in 7 different states currently going on now. A lot of cases, obviously, on voting rights cases in Florida, in California, in Arizona, in Ohio as well. And we are also working on announcing a larger effort to be able to protect Latino vote in November in the 2026 election cycle as well.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think it goes to the point of, this administration just wanting to kind of change the whole dynamic of and the fabric of what America is, right? We've always been considered a nation of immigrants. And so, as it relates to comprehensive immigration reform, which is really what needs to happen in order for a lot of the issues that we're discussing to be addressed. Do you think there's a shot now as it relates to the current bipartisan bill that's in Congress? Is there a shot now to get it past this session? And is there a shot in the future, perhaps in next year's Congress that may have a different partisan composition to get comprehensive immigration reform passed?
So, I think that the question really is specific to the Dignity Act. We have met with Maria Elvira's staff. LULAC has not endorsed the Dignity Act because it does not provide a pathway to citizenship. Okay. And I think that's one of the initial points. Initially, it did. And in the last iteration of it, they basically removed it. The fact that individuals would be able to live with dignity in the United States, but never have a pathway to citizenship. And that's not something that we support. But I think it's important to continue the conversation. I think that Republicans will continue to use this as a wedge issue, specifically in the upcoming election cycle. And you're likely going to see, and what we have seen really in the last week is that the Trump administration will basically respond to the Supreme Court's ruling by more aggressive enforcement action. So last week we saw the report from the New York Times that they had detained and deported over 10,000 immigrants, so over 2,000 basically per day. And so, my sense is that Trump likely feels that he's losing part of his support because they have been weak on immigration enforcement action. Um, I think that their
But
goal.
but
Oh,
but if I could stop you there is bipartisan support for this Dignity Act. You have Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, who's the Democratic sponsor, and you have others who have signed on to the bill. As a matter of fact, if I understand it correctly, there are additional Democrats that want to sign on, but there's not enough Republicans. So they're waiting for more Republicans to sign on in order for it to be truly bipartisan in the way that they describe it. Frankly, uh, I, I personally agree with you. It doesn't really do enough to address the fact that in order for comprehensive immigration reform raise their children here, who are building communities, building businesses, and contributing to our economy. Um, so, is your answer that we're not going to get this done this cycle, and we really have to hope for next time?
so I don't think that Republicans would support it. Period. Trump does not support it now. Pre-election cycle. I will tell you that if Republicans are successful and they retain a majority in the House and the Senate, that you'll likely see a big push for immigration reform between 2026 and 2028, right? If Democrats win, and I think there'll be a reset of that conversation, I think we could potentially see some sort of bipartisan bill because Democrats have been moving a little bit more to the middle or to the right on immigration reform. And so very different conversations from what we had from the Gang of Eight, for example, which included Marco Rubio, where we did have, consensus on immigration reform. So we are moving closer and closer to it. The country does need it. LULAC supports it fully. We support stemming the flow of immigration at the border. We obviously support the detention and deportation of immigrants with a violent criminal history or criminal history overall. But we also support pathway for citizenship for millions of immigrants that are law abiding, who have US born children, who have set up companies that contribute to our nation's economic success. And so we would like to see something that provides a pathway for citizenship for those individuals already here.
And so it seems that with this past week's Supreme Court decisions, it's a mixed bag. Certainly, on the issue of birthright citizenship and affirming the constitutional right that if you're born here, you are a citizen. It is a victory. But certainly, the fight's not over. We
No,
still
no, no.
we're still in it. And so, I know we're running into time. Are there any other thoughts that you want to share with our viewers today regarding our fight for our Constitution, our democracy, and our freedoms? Would love to hear your thoughts on anything else as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I think, one of the things that we have to do is just be ever vigilant, right? The attacks are multi-pronged. The fact that the president thought he could do this by executive fiat, by the signature of a Sharpie, I mean, literally on this executive order really flies in the face of what our democracy is and should be. Luckily, we've had a very aggressive litigation strategy to help stem these executive orders, and we're winning a lot of those cases. So, Latinos have to be much more engaged when it comes to not just this upcoming election cycle, but also what's happening in the courts as well. And I also just want to take a moment to thank you, Catherine, for the incredible leadership and the wonderful work that Latino Victory does. I've always believed that the most direct path to power in our country is through elected office. We can litigate these, and LULAC has litigated these cases. That immigration case that I talked to you about took us over 20 years, 20 years to fight. The birthright citizenship case took us over 2 years from the time that we actually started it. So it's a very long road for justice through the courts. We know that through legislation in Congress, it has been a minefield, especially with the partisanship that we currently see. So the most direct path to power today is getting more Latinos elected into office. And Latino Victory has been leading the charge, and you've been an incredible leader. And I'm so happy to be a partner with you in this fight and part of our coalition of leading Latino organizations to also engage our community on voter education, voter registration, and a GOTV effort that we plan to mount in November. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you so much, Juan. And of course, for our viewers, I want to once again show some appreciation for Juan Proaño, who is the president and CEO at LULAC, the oldest Latino civil rights organization in the country, leading the charge in the courts for a lot of the work that we need to do to preserve our democracy. Certainly a partner in all of the work that we need to do to engage Latino voters this cycle and beyond. Stay tuned. We're going to have another conversation at some point later in the year around this specific political work. But in the meantime, thank you, Juan, for everything that you did to
Mhm.
help preserve birthright citizenship and uplift our Constitution. Thank you to everyone who's listening and who will be listening later. Again, Catherine Pichardo here, President and CEO at Latino Victory, where our one mission is to build Latino political power so our voices and values are reflected in the policies that move our country forward. Thank you, everybody, and have a good Tuesday. Bye bye.
Thank you, Catherine.